Is this some kind of joke? The voice, sharp and serrated, cut through the oppressive quiet of the hangar. It belonged to Cade Jennings, and it was a voice accustomed to being obeyed. Cade was the lead flight systems engineer on Project Spectre, and at 28, he was a wunderkind of avionics, a prodigy of polymer and code. His world was one of clean lines, quantifiable data, and the absolute certainty of digital logic. Before him, the source of his fury sat inert and silent. The UH-99 Spectre was less a helicopter and more a sculpted predator, a dragonfly forged from shadows and secrets. Its skin was a matte black composite that seemed to drink the harsh fluorescent light of the hangar, giving nothing back. Its cockpit was a darkened bubble of armored glass, a silent, unblinking eye. It was a cathedral of modern firepower, a $10 billion testament to American ingenuity. And it would not start. For 6 hours, the cathedral had remained a tomb. Teams of engineers, their faces illuminated by the frantic blue glow of diagnostic tablets, had swarmed its fuselage like ants on a dead beetle. They had run terabytes of data, cycled every power relay, and rebooted the core system 97 times. The Spectre remained stubbornly, arrogantly lifeless. The twin-turbine engines, each capable of churning out enough power to light a small city, refused to even whisper. Cade's jaw was a knot of tension. His flight suit, a marvel of breathable synthetics in shades of charcoal and tactical gray, felt like a cage. He ran a hand through his perfectly coiffed hair, his frustration a palpable static in the air. This was not just a failure, it was a personal affront. He had designed half the software that ran this bird. It was an extension of his own mind, his own will. For it to defy him was like a limb refusing to move. This is impossible, his mind screamed. Every system reports nominal. Every line of code is perfect. It has to be user error. But there was no user. There was only a machine, perfect and pristine, that had decided to die. That was when the hangar doors had rolled open with a low groan, parting to reveal the source of Cade's latest and most profound wave of indignation. General Morrison had sent for him. An old man stood silhouetted against the bright afternoon sun, his form frail and stooped. He wore no uniform, no flight suit. Instead, he was dressed in faded blue jeans, scuffed leather boots, and a brown leather jacket so old it looked like a second skin, its surface a road map of cracks and creases. His hair was a wisp of silver white, and his face was a landscape of deep-set wrinkles carved by time and sun. He carried nothing but the weight of his 80-plus years. This was Silas Croft. The solution. Cade watched, his lips curled in a sneer of pure contempt, as the old man walked slowly, deliberately, toward the silent behemoth. Each step was measured, a quiet conversation with the concrete floor. There was no urgency in his gait, no sign that he understood the monumental pressure of the situation. The Secretary of Defense was waiting for a status report. A dozen news helicopters were probably already circling the base perimeter, sniffing out a story. And they sent him a museum piece. With all due respect, sir, Cade said, his voice dripping with the opposite, turning to the aide who had escorted the old man in. What is he going to do? Tell it war stories? Maybe bore it into submission. The aide, a young lieutenant with nervous eyes, refused to meet Cade's gaze. My orders were just to bring him here, Mr. Jennings. General Morrison's direct command. Silas Croft seemed not to hear, or perhaps not to care. He stopped a few feet from the Spectre's nose, his head tilted slightly. He was not looking at the diagnostic ports or the access panels. He was just looking at the machine itself, his gaze quiet and contemplative, as if he were sizing up a wild horse, not a collection of circuits and wires. The contrast was a physical blow. The Spectre was the absolute pinnacle of the new. It was a machine of the 21st century, a network of light-speed processors and self-correcting algorithms. Silas Croft was a relic of the old world. A world of analog dials, hydraulic fluid, and gut feelings. A world of wood and steel, not carbon fiber and silicon. This is a waste of time, Cade thought, the anger simmering in his gut turning into a cold, hard fury. Morrison is losing it. He thinks some old pilot's magic touch is going to fix a recursive loop in the primary ignition handshake. He might as well have brought a priest to perform an exorcism. He decided to assert control. This was his hangar. His project. Excuse me, Cade said, his voice loud and authoritative. He strode over to Silas, planting himself squarely between the old man and the helicopter. He was a full head taller, a pillar of youthful confidence and crisp, clean lines against the old man's weathered form. "I am Cade Jennings. I'm the lead engineer here. I don't know who you are or why you're here, but this is a restricted area, and we have a sensitive situation." Silas Croft finally turned his eyes from the helicopter to Cade. They were pale blue, the color of a winter sky, and held a depth that seemed to absorb Cade's bluster without reflection. They were calm, patient, and utterly unimpressed. The old man offered a slow, deliberate blink. Then, he said nothing. The silence was more infuriating than any argument. It was a quiet dismissal, a refusal to even acknowledge the validity of Cade's authority. "Look," Cade said, his voice rising, a flush creeping up his neck. "We have the best technicians in the world working on this. We've run every diagnostic known to man. Whatever you think you're going to do, you're not." Around them, the other engineers and pilots had stopped their work. They watched the confrontation, a silent audience to the clash of eras. They saw Cade, their brilliant, arrogant leader, bristling with indignation. And they saw the old man, a ghost from a history they had only read about, standing his ground with nothing but stillness. Silas's gaze drifted past Cade, back to the specter. His lips, thin and bloodless, parted slightly. "She's listening," he said. His voice was gravelly, a low rumble that seemed to come from deep in his chest. It was not loud, but it carried in the vast, silent space. Cade almost laughed. He physically restrained himself, but a sharp, derisive snort escaped his lips. "Listening. It's a machine. It's got a processing core, not a soul. It doesn't listen." He jabbed a finger toward the cockpit. "The FICS, the Flight Ignition Control System, is locked in a secure boot failure. It's not responding to any external prompts. It's a digital problem. A code problem." Silas's eyes moved slowly, tracing the lines of the helicopter from the tail rotor to the nose-mounted sensor array. His expression was unreadable, a mask of serene neutrality. "All machines listen," Silas said, his voice still a quiet murmur. "You just have to know how to talk to them." This was too much. The condescension, the folksy wisdom, the sheer, unadulterated ignorance of it all. Cade felt the last of his professional composure snap. His internal monologue was a torrent of scorn. This fossil thinks he can sweet-talk a multi-threaded operating system. He probably thinks the internet is delivered by carrier pigeon. Right. "Okay, Grandpa," Cade said, the insult sharp and deliberate. He took another step forward, closing the remaining space, using his physical presence as a tool of intimidation. "We don't have time for this mythology lesson. The adults are trying to work here. So unless you have a degree in quantum computing you forgot to mention, I'm going to have to ask you to step away from my helicopter." He emphasized the word "my." It was a claim of ownership, of dominion. Silas did not step away. He did not flinch. His pale blue eyes remained fixed on Cade, his placid exterior a stark contrast to the storm of arrogance brewing within the young engineer. The old man's gaze was not challenging. It was diagnostic. He seemed to be looking right through Cade's expensive flight suit, past the bravado and the anger, and seeing the insecure, frightened boy at the core. "She's not yours," Silas said softly. The statement was not an argument, it was a simple correction of fact. The quiet defiance pushed Cade over the edge. Humiliating the senile old man was no longer just a desire, it was a necessity. He needed to re-establish the hierarchy, to prove that his world of data and logic was superior to whatever sentimental nonsense this relic believed in. "Security!" Cade yelled, his voice echoing off the high ceiling of the hangar. "We have an unauthorized civilian on the floor. I want him removed. Now." Two uniformed security guards, young men with the same crisp, modern look as Cade, began to walk purposefully toward them. Silas remained perfectly still. He simply watched them approach, his expression unchanged. He raised a hand, not in a gesture of surrender, but slowly, deliberately, toward his own chest. His gnarled, arthritic fingers went to the lapel of his ancient leather jacket. Pinned there was a small, almost unnoticeable object. It was not a military medal or a ribbon. It was a small piece of dark, polished wood, hand-carved into the shape of a hawk in mid-dive. It was worn smooth with time, the details softened, but the fierce, predatory energy of the carving was still palpable. Silas's thumb stroked the wooden hawk, a gesture of unconscious habit. As his skin touched the wood, the world inside his head shifted. For a fraction of a second, the fluorescent lights of the hangar vanished. The smell of ozone and sterile lubricant was replaced by the thick, cloying stench of jet fuel and swamp mud. The concrete floor became the vibrating steel deck of a ship. The silence was shattered by the rhythmic, deafening whump-whump-whump of rotor blades tearing through humid air. He felt the phantom weight of a helmet on his head, the slick sweat on the grips of the cyclic stick. He heard a voice crackling in his ear, young and terrified. "Ghost One, they're everywhere. We're going down. I repeat, we are going down." The flashback was gone as quickly as it came, a ghost of a memory that left no trace on his stoic face. But the feeling remained, a cold coil of adrenaline deep in his belly. The security guards were closer now, their faces set and impassive. "Sir," one of them said, his voice polite but firm. "You need to come with us." Cade crossed his arms, a smirk of triumph playing on his lips. The problem was being handled. The distraction was being removed. He could finally get back to the real work of solving a real problem, unburdened by folksy mysticism. "Let's go, old-timer," Cade goaded. "The nursing home is probably missing its star shuffleboard player." Silas's hand fell away from the wooden hawk. He looked at the approaching guards, then at Cade's smug face. He took a single, slow step, not backward, but to the side, placing himself directly in the path to the Spectre's cockpit door. It was a quiet, final act of defiance. A refusal to be moved. "I am not leaving," he said, his voice still low, but now underscored by a vein of pure, unyielding iron. This was the point of no return. Cade's face hardened into a mask of cold fury. He would not be defied. Not here. Not in front of his team. "You heard me. Get him out of here," Cade commanded the guards. "If he resists, you are authorized to use force." The guards exchanged a hesitant glance. Using force on an elderly man felt wrong, orders or not. "Sir, please," the first guard tried again. "Just come with us. We don't want any trouble." In the small crowd of onlookers, a man stood apart. He was not one of Cade's young tech acolytes. He was in his late 40s, a maintenance sergeant named Miller, his face weathered, his uniform showing the quiet competence of a career non-commissioned officer. He had been watching the entire exchange with a growing sense of deep, profound unease. He had seen old-timers before. He had seen the quiet dignity of combat veterans. But there was something different about this one. It was in the way he stood, the economy of his motion. It was a stillness that was not passive, but coiled. Ready. Miller's eyes, trained to spot minuscule flaws in engine assemblies and rotor masts, narrowed. He wasn't looking at the old man's face. He was looking at his hands. They were gnarled with age, yes, but they rested at his sides with a specific kind of neutrality, a posture drilled into a man by 1,000 hours at the controls. Fingers slightly curled, thumbs ready. A pilot's hands. Then Miller's gaze caught the glint of dark wood on the man's lapel. The carved hawk. A story, a legend he'd heard years ago from an old instructor at Fort Rucker, flickered in his mind. A story about a pilot in Vietnam, a man who flew a stripped-down, beat-to-hell Huey with such impossible skill that the Viet Cong thought he was a spirit, a phantom. A pilot who once flew a rescue mission into a valley so hot they called it the Devil's Anvil, flying a bird so damaged it was held together by wire and prayer. His call sign was Ghost, but the men he saved, they called him something else. They called him the Hawk of Unlock, because he descended from the sky like a bird of prey. The legend said the pilot was given a carving by one of the men he'd pulled from the fire. A wooden hawk. Miller's blood ran cold. It could not be. That man would be ancient now. A myth. A ghost story told to frighten rookie pilots. He watched as the guards put their hands on Silas Croft's arms. He saw the old man's body remain completely relaxed, yet immovable, like an old oak tree. He saw the final, contemptuous sneer on Cade Jennings's face. And he knew. A grave injustice was about to happen. A sacrilege. With a speed that belied his stocky frame, Miller turned and moved toward the hangar office. He did not run, but his strides were long and urgent. He ignored the questioning looks from his colleagues. He pushed into the small, glass-walled office, snatched the receiver of the secure landline, and punched in a number he had not dialed in over a decade. A direct line to the Pentagon. To the personal office of a four-star general he had once served under as a young crew chief. The phone was answered on the second ring. General Thorne's office. "This is Master Sergeant Miller at Edwards Air Force Base," he said, his voice low and tight with urgency. "I need to speak with the general. It's a ghost-level priority." There was a pause. "Ghost level? Sergeant, do you know what that designation implies?" "Yes, I do," Miller said, his eyes darting back to the hangar floor, where the guards were now trying to physically move Silas, who stood like a rock. You tell him the Hawk of Unlock is at Edwards. And they're about to put him in cuffs." On the other end of the line, there was a sharp intake of breath, a clatter as if a pen had been dropped, and then the frantic, muffled sound of a door being thrown open. "Hold the line, Sergeant. Hold the line." Outside, Cade's patience was gone. "I gave you an order. Remove him." The guards gritted their teeth and pulled harder. Silas did not resist, yet he did not move, a paradox of physics. His feet seemed fused to the concrete. It was at that precise moment, the absolute apex of Cade's triumph and Silas's public humiliation, that a sound cut through the air. It was not a sound that belonged in a sterile hangar. It was the high-pitched, insistent shriek of tires on asphalt, followed by another, and another. Every head in the hangar snapped toward the massive open doors. A motorcade of 3 black, government-issue SUVs had screeched to a halt just outside, their doors flying open before the vehicles had even fully stopped. Men in dark suits and military uniforms poured out, their movements precise and urgent. From the lead vehicle emerged a figure who commanded instant silence. He was a tall, imposing man in a perfectly tailored Army Class A uniform, the chest of which was a constellation of ribbons. 4 silver stars glittered on each of his shoulder boards. It was General Marcus Thorne, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The entire hangar seemed to hold its breath. The air crackled with a sudden, seismic shift in authority. General Thorne strode into the hangar, his polished boots clicking on the concrete with the sound of a judge's gavel. His eyes, the color of cold steel, swept the scene once, taking in the inert helicopter, the crowd of stunned engineers, the arrogant young men in the flight suit, and the 2 guards laying hands on a stooped old man. Cade Jennings felt a knot of ice form in his stomach. He did not know what was happening, but he knew it was not good. He instinctively straightened up, trying to project the authority that had evaporated the moment Thorne had entered. The general's path was a straight line. He walked directly toward the confrontation, his face an unreadable granite slab. Cade, assuming the general was coming to him for a report, took a half-step forward, ready to explain the situation, to justify his actions. General Thorne walked past him as if he were a ghost. He did not slow down. He did not grant Cade so much as a flicker of a glance. It was a snub so complete, so absolute, that it was more devastating than any rebuke. In that single moment, Cade Jennings ceased to exist. He was rendered utterly insignificant. Thorne came to a halt directly in front of Silas Croft. The 2 security guards froze, their hands still on the old man's arms, their faces pale with shock and terror. The 4-star general, one of the most powerful men in the United States military, looked at the frail, silent old man in the worn leather jacket. Then, with a motion as sharp and clean as a rifle bolt, he snapped his hand up to his brow in a perfect, rigid salute. "Mr. Croft," General Thorne's voice boomed, resonating with a profound, unshakable respect that filled every corner of the vast space. "Sir. It is an honor." The 2 guards snatched their hands away from Silas as if he had suddenly caught fire. They stumbled back, their faces a mask of horrified understanding. Cade Jennings stood frozen, his mind refusing to process what his eyes were seeing. The world had just turned upside down. Thorne held the salute for a long, pregnant moment before slowly lowering his hand. He turned his head slightly, his gaze falling upon Cade for the first time. It was not a look of anger. It was a look of something far worse, pity and disgust. "Son," Thorne said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. "Do you have any idea who you were just manhandling?" Cade could not speak. His throat had closed up. He could only shake his head, a tiny, pathetic motion. Thorn's eyes swept over the silent, watching crowd. You are all witness today. You are witness to the arrogance of a generation that has forgotten its history. You stand here, surrounded by digital miracles, and you look at this man and see nothing but an obstacle. He gestured to Silas. This man, Silas Croft, is the reason half the avionics you take for granted even exist. You read about him in textbooks, but you don't know his name. You use procedures he invented in the heart of a firefight, but you don't know his face. Thorn took a deep breath, his chest swelling. They called him the Ghost in the skies over Vietnam. He was not a man, he was a legend. He flew missions that were certified impossible. He held his bird together with his bare hands and his sheer force of will. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle into the stunned silence. He then reached into his own pocket and pulled out a folded, yellowed piece of paper. He carefully unfolded it. "Let me read you something," he said, his voice now taking on the formal cadence of a citation. October 1969. An Long Valley. A long-range reconnaissance patrol is ambushed, pinned down, with multiple critical casualties. 2 medevac helicopters are shot down attempting a rescue. The zone is declared too hot for entry. A suicide run. Thorn's eyes lifted from the paper and found Silas. But one pilot disobeyed that order. Flying a Huey, designation Vulture 2-6, which had already taken heavy fire. His co-pilot was dead. His instruments were shot out. He had a hydraulic leak that should have made controlled flight impossible. He looked back at the paper. Over the next 90 minutes, then Warrant Officer Croft made 4 separate landings under intense, direct enemy fire. He hovered his crippled aircraft with one door gunner laying on the floor, calling out altitudes because his altimeter was gone. He used the reflection in his own watch to gauge his rotor tilt. A wave of murmurs spread through the crowd. Cade felt lightheaded, the blood draining from his face. On his final approach, Thorn continued, his voice thick with emotion, his main fuel line was severed. With his bird bleeding fuel, he landed one last time, shut down his engine to conserve what was left, and helped carry the last wounded men aboard himself. Then, with the enemy less than 50 meters away, he somehow coaxed the dying engine back to life and flew 16 men to safety. Thorn's gaze hardened as he looked back at Cade. The lead designer of your precious Spectre's core operating system, Dr. Eris Thorn, was one of those 16 men. He was my father. This man saved my father's life. The hangar was as silent as a vacuum. The only sound was the frantic pounding of Cade's own heart. Thorn carefully folded the citation and put it away. He turned to Silas. "Sir. The floor is yours." Silas gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. He turned and walked to the Spectre's cockpit door. This time, no one dared stand in his way. The crowd parted for him like the Red Sea. With a slight groan of effort, he pulled himself up into the cockpit. His movements were slow, methodical, each one imbued with a lifetime of practice. He settled into the pilot's seat, a throne of carbon fiber and memory foam that seemed to mold itself around his frail form. Cade watched, mesmerized and horrified, as the old man's hands moved over the controls. They did not fly across the console in a blur of expertise as Cade's would have. They moved with the slowness of a glacier's crawl, yet with an unshakable purpose. Silas did not initiate the standard boot sequence. He did not run a diagnostic. His left hand rested gently on the collective stick. His right hand reached out, his gnarled finger hovering over the main touchscreen display. It was dark, lifeless. He did not press the on button. Instead, he tapped the screen. Once. Twice. A third time. Not in the designated activation zone, but in the upper left-hand corner, where there was nothing but black glass. Then he traced a pattern on the screen. A slow, deliberate line down. A sharp diagonal up. Another down. It was the shape of a lightning bolt. A crude, simple glyph. For a moment, nothing happened. Cade's mind, still reeling, latched onto this. See. It's useless. He's just tapping on a dead screen. Then, a single pixel in the center of the display flickered to life. It was a tiny point of white light in an ocean of black. Silas's finger moved to the panel just below the screen, a row of identical, unmarked toggle switches for auxiliary systems. He ignored the labels. He counted 4 switches from the left. He flipped it up. Then down. Then up again. A low hum began to emanate from the cockpit, a sound no one had heard all day. It was the sound of capacitors charging deep within the helicopter's heart. Finally, Silas's hand went to the dual-engine starter knobs on the center console. Protocol dictated they be turned sequentially. He gripped them both, one in each hand. And he turned them simultaneously. Deep within the Spectre's fuselage, a relay clicked. A fuel pump whined to life. And then, a sound like the world tearing open. The port-side turbine engine ignited with a deafening roar, a blast of hot air washing over the stunned faces in the hangar. A second later, the starboard engine followed, its own thunderous voice joining the chorus. The entire airframe of the Spectre began to vibrate, alive and angry. The rotor blades, which had been drooping like willow branches, began to twitch and then spin, slowly at first, then faster and faster until they were just a transparent, shimmering disk above the helicopter. The UH-99 Spectre was alive. The crowd erupted in a spontaneous wave of applause and shocked shouts. Inside the cockpit, Silas Croft's hands rested calmly on the controls as the machine thrummed around him. He looked out through the armored glass, his face impassive. He reached up and, with the same deliberate sequence, shut the engines down. The roar subsided, replaced once again by a ringing silence. He climbed out of the cockpit as slowly as he had climbed in. He stood on the concrete, the ancient leather jacket a stark contrast to the perfect, living machine beside him. General Thorne walked over to him, his face a mixture of awe and gratitude. How did you know? Silas looked at the general, then his gaze drifted to Cade, who stood pale and shaking, his world completely shattered. Eris, Silas said, his voice raspy. Your father. He was a brilliant engineer. But he was sentimental. He tapped his own chest, where the wooden hawk was pinned. The bird I flew that day, she was a ghost. Held together by nothing. To get her started after we took on the wounded, I had to bypass the main ignition. I tapped the radio casing 3 times to settle a loose wire, flipped a broken circuit breaker twice, and turned both starter keys at once to draw power from the battery directly. A 1 in a million shot. He looked at the Spectre. Your father remembered. He built a ghost into his new machine. A tribute. An Easter egg. A lock that only an old friend would have the key to. The full, crushing weight of the truth descended upon Cade Jennings. It was not a hardware failure. It was not a software bug. It was a test. A secret handshake across 50 years of history, encoded in software, and he had been too arrogant, too blind, too sure of his own genius to even conceive of it. He had been trying to pick a lock with a supercomputer when all it needed was the right knock. General Thorne turned his full, wrathful attention to Cade. His voice dropped, becoming a blade of ice. You stand on the shoulders of giants, son, and you have the audacity to spit on their shoes, Thorne hissed. You have knowledge, but you have no wisdom. You have data, but you have no respect. You see a man's age, and you record it as a liability, not as a library. You failed today. Not as an engineer, but as an officer and as a man. Cade could only stammer. Sir. I didn't know. That is the entire point. Thorne roared, his voice cracking like a whip. Your job is to know. Your job is to respect the chain of command, and that includes the history that forged it. You are a disgrace to that uniform. Thorne's anger was a physical force, pressing down on Cade, who looked as if he might collapse. It was then that a quiet voice cut through the tension. He's just a boy, Marcus. It was Silas. He had walked over and now stood beside the trembling young engineer. He placed a gnarled hand on Cade's shoulder. The touch was surprisingly gentle. He was doing his job, Silas continued, his voice calm and even. The boy is smart. He sees the world in ones and zeros. He just needs to learn that some things can't be calculated. He looked at Cade, his pale blue eyes holding not condemnation, but a sliver of understanding. Pride is a heavy burden to fly with. It makes the air thicker. The grace of the gesture was more shaming than any punishment. To be defended by the very men he had so viciously humiliated was a lesson more profound than any thorn could deliver. Tears welled in Cade's eyes. A single, hot tear traced a path down his cheek. "I'm sorry," he whispered, the words barely audible. "Sir. I am so sorry." Silas gave his shoulder a gentle squeeze and then let go. He turned to General Thorne. "My work is done here. I'd like to go home." Cade Jennings was not fired. At Silas Croft's personal request to the general, he was reassigned. He was sent to the military archives at Fort Rucker, a place filled with dusty files, faded photographs, and the paper ghosts of forgotten heroes. His job was to digitize the service records of Vietnam-era pilots. It was a quiet, humbling purgatory. The incident at Edwards Air Force Base became a quiet legend. It led to the creation of a new mandatory module in leadership training for all branches of the armed forces. It was a simple program focused on history, heritage, and respect. They called it the Croft Protocol. 6 months later, Cade was sitting in a small cafe near the base, nursing a cup of coffee. He was no longer the sharp, arrogant prodigy. His hair was not perfect. He wore a simple civilian polo shirt. His eyes, once so full of fire and certainty, were now quiet and reflective. The bell above the door chimed, and Silas Croft walked in. He moved with the same slow, deliberate pace. He ordered a black coffee and was about to sit at a small table by the window. Cade's heart pounded. He stood up. He walked over to the old man. Silas looked up, his pale eyes showing a flicker of recognition. Cade did not say a word. He simply stood before him, straightened his back, and offered a slow, respectful nod. It was a gesture of profound apology, of learned humility, of a debt that could never be repaid. Silas Croft held his gaze for a long moment. Then, a small, almost imperceptible smile touched the corners of his mouth. He returned the nod. A simple gesture of forgiveness, of closure. As Silas sat down to drink his coffee, Cade walked away, feeling a weight lift from his soul that had been there for half a year. He had learned the hard way that the most advanced systems are not always made of wires and code. Some are forged in history, tempered by sacrifice, and powered by a spirit that no diagnostic tool can ever measure. True legends are not defined by the machines they command, but by the quiet dignity of the hands that guide them.